For 2 years, my millionaire son thought he gave me a beautiful lake house. In reality, I was scrubbing floors while his wife secretly lived a life of luxury using my name. What's the true cost of a mother's silence? This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's about the day I decided to cash the receipt. My days began and ended with the same quiet hum. It wasn't the sound of a happy home full of life and laughter, but the low electric thrum of an old refrigerator in a small apartment. It was the sound of being alone. I'm Evelyn, and this is my story, coming to you from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and if it touches something inside, you comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this truth has traveled. From my window, I watched the seasons turn over in the small patch of park across the street. I saw the fiery blush of autumn maples give way to the stark skeletal branches of winter, and then the shy green buds of spring. They were my only constant companions. For most of my 72 years, I had been anything but alone. I was a wife to a good man, Robert, and a mother to a son, David, who was the very center of my world. Our home had been filled with the scent of baking bread, the sound of Robert's booming laugh, and the endless energy of a growing boy. After Robert passed, it was just me and David, and my life's purpose sharpened into a single point: to see him succeed, to make sure the foundation his father and I had built for him was strong enough to support any dream he could build. And he had built a skyscraper. David was a millionaire. He'd had a brilliant mind for technology and an ambition that had always burned bright. I was so proud it was a physical ache in my chest. But success, I learned, builds walls as much as it builds fortunes. The phone calls, once daily, became weekly, then dwindled to holidays and birthdays. I understood. He had a wife, Melissa, and a demanding career. I did not want to be a burden. That was the phrase I repeated to myself like a prayer, a shield against the creeping loneliness. I had spent my life giving, and I did not know how to ask for anything in return. I was the foundation, and foundations are meant to be silent, to be buried and forgotten, holding everything up without needing acknowledgement. So I existed in the quiet. I read books from the library until the words blurred. I made a single cup of tea in the morning and a small dinner for one at night. The four walls of my government-subsidized apartment were neat and tidy, a testament to a life of order. But they held no warmth. They just held me. I had become a tolerated ghost in the epilogue of my own life, a background character in a story that had long since erased my name from the script. I thought I was being a good mother, teaching my son independence and strength. But I was learning a hard lesson. Sometimes the love you give is taken not as a gift, but as a resource to be consumed. I told myself it was a dignified silence, a mother's final gift of space to her successful son. But sometimes, in the dead of night, the silence felt less like a gift and more like an echo bouncing off walls that had forgotten the sound of my name. It was a slow, quiet eraser, and I was letting it happen. David was a good son. I held on to that belief like a rosary. It was the bedrock of my memory, the one truth that could not be shaken, even as evidence to the contrary mounted like unread mail. I remembered him as a boy, with scraped knees and a brilliant smile, who brought me wilting dandelions he called flowers. I remembered him as a teenager, all awkward limbs and surging ambition, who would talk for hours about the companies he would one day build. I had worked 2 jobs after his father died, cleaning houses during the day and stocking shelves at night to make sure he got through college without a penny of debt. I saw it not as a sacrifice, but as an investment. Paper remembers what people forget, and his diploma was a receipt for a promise I believed he would keep. His wife, Melissa, was the physical embodiment of that bright future he'd built. She was perfect. Her hair was always flawlessly styled, her clothes were elegant, and her smile was a brilliant, polished thing. When she entered a room, she drew all the light toward her. David was utterly devoted to her, and for that I was grateful. A man needs a good woman, and Melissa on the surface was better than good. She was impeccable. But I've learned that the most pristine surfaces can hide the deepest cracks. She became the gatekeeper to my son's world. When I called, it was often Melissa who answered, her voice smooth and sweet as honey. "Oh, Evelyn, he's in a meeting right now. He's been working so hard. I'll be sure to tell him you called." The messages were always passed along, I was sure, but the return calls grew less frequent. He was a busy, important man, a millionaire. His time was a currency I could no longer afford. I was a line item that had been crossed off his budget. I learned about their life through the glossy photos Melissa posted online. It was a strange modern torture to watch your own child's life unfold through a screen at the public library, the slow dial-up connection, a buffer between my world and his. There they were on a yacht in the Mediterranean, smiling in front of a glittering Eiffel Tower, raising champagne glasses at a charity gala. Their life was a movie, and I was watching it from a distant, dark theater. I'd click through the images, my heart swelling with a strange mixture of pride and a deep, hollow ache. He was happy. That was all that mattered. But have you ever wondered if the happiness you see online is real? Or is it just a story someone is telling themselves? My own life was the inverse of his. My savings drained by Robert's long illness had finally run out. My Social Security check was a small, grim number that barely covered rent and utilities. I started buying day-old bread and bruised fruit from the market. I turned the heat down until I could see my breath in the morning wearing the worn-out cardigan Robert had loved. I never told David. It would have felt like a failure, a stain on his perfect life. He was a son to be proud of, and I was determined to be a mother he did not have to worry about. He lived in the sun, and I was content to remain in his shadow, believing its coolness was a form of protection. I didn't realize that a shadow isn't protection. It is simply the absence of light. Melissa called it keeping up appearances. It was her favorite phrase, a mantra she used to justify the glossy, hollow perfection of her life. To her, the world was a stage, and she was both the lead actress and the director. Every piece of furniture in their sprawling home, every vacation photo, every social interaction was meticulously curated to project an image of effortless wealth and flawless happiness. She wasn't just building a life. She was building a brand. And I was not part of the brand. When I visited for Christmas that first year after my savings disappeared, I felt like a miscast extra who had wandered onto the wrong set. Their home was beautiful, a sterile masterpiece of white carpets and glass tables. It was so clean and quiet. It felt like a museum, a place where no one actually lived. my small handmade gifts, a knitted scarf for David, a jar of my spiced apple butter for Melissa, looked clumsy and rustic on the marble countertop, like weeds in a manicured garden. They were artifacts from a life of substance in a world that only valued style. Melissa treated me with a kind of cloying, condescending sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "Evelyn, dear, let me get you a coaster for that tea. We wouldn't want to stain the table, would we?" She'd say, her smile never reaching her eyes. She spoke to me as if I were a child, or perhaps a senile old woman who couldn't be trusted with sharp objects. She called me Evelyn, never Mom, a subtle but constant reminder that I was an outsider, his mother, not hers. It was a small thing, a quiet shift, but that's how the erasure always begins. Not with a shout, but with a whisper. I watched the way she managed David. She would touch his arm lightly when she wanted to steer him away from a conversation, or give him a look, a tiny, almost imperceptible narrowing of her eyes that would silence him mid-sentence. He seemed oblivious, wrapped in the glow of her affection. He saw a loving wife. I saw a masterful puppeteer. I'd spent my life raising a strong son, but I was watching him become a well-managed accessory. The slow eraser had begun its work. It wasn't loud or cruel enough for anyone else to notice, but I felt it in every condescending smile, every polite interruption. I was being gently, methodically pushed to the margins. During that Christmas dinner, their friends asked me what I did to keep busy. Before I could answer, Melissa laughed her light, airy laugh. "Oh, Evelyn is just enjoying her retirement, taking it easy. We make sure she doesn't have to worry about a thing." The words hung in the air, a perfect glittering lie. I sat there in my $12 dress from the thrift store, and I said nothing. I always said nothing. For a moment I felt shame, not anger, not even sadness, just shame, the quiet, aching kind that makes you feel like a fool for hoping. I just smiled, playing my part in her production, a contented old woman in a gilded cage, whose bars were invisible to everyone but me. I was a ghost, sitting in a chair that no one wanted filled. About a year and a half after Robert's passing, David called me. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and his voice sounded distant, crackling over the line as if coming from another world. But it was him, not Melissa, and my heart gave a hopeful leap it hadn't made in a very long time. "Mom, how are you?" "Really?" he asked, a rare note of genuine concern in his voice. "I'm fine, dear." "Just fine," I said, my standard protective reply. A mother's instinct is to shield her children from worry, even when they are grown men who could buy and sell the world. "No, listen," he insisted, and I could hear the rustle of papers in the background. "I've been talking with Melissa, and we've been worried. We know you're too proud to ask for anything, but you shouldn't have to be scraping by." It's not right. A knot of shame and relief tightened in my stomach. "David, I'm managing." "No, Mom. I'm done with you just managing," he said, and his tone was firm, the voice of the CEO he had become. It was the voice that commanded boardrooms, the voice I had dreamed he would one day possess. "I'm setting up a direct deposit. $1,500 a month. It's nothing to me, and it'll make sure you can be comfortable. Buy the good groceries, turn up the heat. Melissa's handling the bank details. She'll get it all sorted." I was stunned into silence. $1,500 a month was more than twice my Social Security check. It was a lifeline I hadn't dared to even dream of. David, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, he said, his voice softening. And that's not all. I've been looking at properties. Found a perfect little place for you. A cottage right on Lake Norman. 2 bedrooms so we can come and visit. A little porch for you to sit on. I'm buying it for you, Mom. My gift. So you can have the peace you deserve. Tears sprang to my eyes, hot and sudden. A house. My own house again. A place with light and air and the sound of water. After years of feeling like wallpaper that hurt, this felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. A lake house. I whispered the words catching in my throat. Melissa's handling the paperwork. She's amazing with this stuff, a real shark. She'll get the deed and everything in your name. Just think of it, Mom. Your own place. No more cramped apartments. The conversation ended with me feeling breathless, my mind reeling with the sheer magnitude of his generosity. My son hadn't forgotten me. He saw me. He loved me. He was taking care of me. For weeks, I walked on air. I went to the library and looked up pictures of Lake Norman, imagining myself on a small porch, a cup of tea in my hand, watching the sunset over the water. The promise was a seed of hope planted in the barren soil of my life. I waited for it to grow, not realizing it had been sown in dust. I didn't know then that some gifts aren't gifts at all. They're just stories we are told. The first of the month came and went. I checked my bank account at the ATM, my heart pounding with a nervous excitement. The balance was the same small, grim number it always was. No deposit. I told myself there was a delay. Banks could be slow. Melissa was probably just getting the paperwork finalized. I waited. I have always been good at waiting. Another month passed. Then another. The promised $1,500 never appeared. The silence from David and Melissa on the subject was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered my hope. I imagined bringing it up, the words forming in my mind, David dear, about that money. But they always dissolved before I could speak them. Asking felt like an accusation. It felt greedy. He was my millionaire son, but I was the mother who had taught him the value of $1. I couldn't bring myself to sound like I was chasing him for a handout. My pride was a stubborn, heavy thing, and it kept my mouth shut. It's a strange trap, isn't it? When the people who are supposed to care for you make you feel ashamed to ask for what you were freely promised. The lake house became a similar phantom, a beautiful dream that faded with the morning light. I stopped looking at pictures of Lake Norman. It was too painful. I constructed a story in my own mind to soothe the ache of disappointment. The deal must have fallen through. David was too busy to tell me. He didn't want to disappoint me, so he just stayed silent. It was easier to believe that than to believe he had lied. Or worse, that he had forgotten. Hope is a fragile thing, and sometimes the stories we tell ourselves are the only things that keep it from shattering completely. The weight of nothing is a strange and heavy burden. It's the weight of expectations unmet, of promises that evaporate, of a future that was dangled before you only to be snatched away. I felt foolish for my brief shining hope. I had allowed myself to dream of a life of ease, and the universe had corrected me. My place was here, in this small, dim apartment, with the smell of my neighbor's cooking seeping through the walls. It was a constant reminder that other people's lives were full and warm, while mine was shrinking. The little money I had was almost gone. The choice became stark. I could call my son and beg cementing myself as the burden I so feared becoming, or I could stand on my own 2 feet. The decision was easy. I found an old faded dress in my closet, put on my most sensible shoes, and walked to the community center. I looked at the job board, my eyes scanning past the office temp positions until they landed on something I could do. Something no one needed a degree for. Cleaners, wanted, evening shifts, reliable individuals only. I wrote down the number. My hands were old, but they were still strong enough to hold a mop. They were still strong enough to hold on to my pride. I was never in the way. I was the foundation. And if no one was going to build on that foundation, I would have to hold it up myself. The office building I cleaned was a world away from my son's gleaming corporate headquarters. It was a place of quiet desperation of startups that would likely fail, and small law firms that smelled of dusty files and stale coffee. My shift started at 7 p.m. after the last of the daytime workers had trickled out, leaving behind their half-empty cups and the faint scent of ambition. My world became one of fluorescent lights that hummed over empty cubicles, the squeak of my rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, and the sharp, clean smell of bleach. Bleach became the perfume of my survival. I was 72 years old, scrubbing toilets and wiping down desks stained with coffee rings. My back ached in a way that was deep and constant. My knees protested every time I had to kneel to scrub a stubborn spot from the floor. My hands, once soft, became chapped and red, the knuckles swollen. I would look at them under the harsh lights of the staff bathroom. These hands that had once baked bread and held my son's small fingers, and I would see the hands of a stranger. These were the hands of a woman who had become invisible. But there was a strange, fierce pride in it. Every dollar I earned was my own. It was honest work. It kept me from having to make the phone call I dreaded. It kept me independent. When I bought groceries with the cash I'd earned, the food tasted better. It was the taste of self-reliance. It was the taste of not being a burden. The world may have forgotten my value, but every clean floor and sparkling window was a receipt proof that I was still here, still working, still contributing. I was not dead weight. Sometimes late at night, as I emptied trash cans, filled with the debris of other people's successful lives, spreadsheets with impressive figures, memos about corporate mergers, I would think of David and Melissa. I pictured them in their beautiful home, sleeping on 1,000 thread count sheets, completely unaware that David's mother was on her hands and knees, wiping away the grime of strangers. What would they think if they knew? Would they feel shame? Or would they, as I suspected, feel nothing at all? The irony was not lost on me. In their world, the one they projected online and at dinner parties, I was the woman being cared for, the recipient of a generous monthly stipend, the owner of a lovely lake house. Melissa's Christmas card that year had even included a little note written in her perfect looping script. Hope you're enjoying the peace and quiet. Evelyn David is so happy, knowing you're comfortable. I read the words standing in my tiny apartment that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner, and a coldness settled in my heart. They weren't just neglecting me. They were living in a completely separate reality one they had invented to feel good about themselves. I was living in the real world, and the real world smelled of bleach. They were toasting their luck. I was cashing the truth, one small, painful paycheck at a time. He called 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. "Mom, we're coming to you this year," David announced, his voice booming with a forced cheer that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No big party, just the three of us. We'll bring the turkey, you just relax." A wave of cold panic washed over me. Them here, in this cramped, bleak apartment that always smelled faintly of my neighbor's cooking and my own quiet poverty. My life of scrubbing floors was my secret, a private shame I guarded fiercely. Having them see it, see the threadbare sofa and the cracked linoleum, felt like a violation. It felt like letting them see the receipt for their neglect. But I couldn't say no. A mother doesn't say no. The day arrived gray and cold. I had spent 3 days cleaning, scrubbing the tiny space until it shone, trying to erase the scent of bleach and replace it with cinnamon and cloves. I used my own hard-earned money to buy a small pumpkin pie and a cheap bouquet of chrysanthemums to put on the table. It was a futile effort. The apartment was still what it was, small, old, and sad. They arrived like royalty visiting the provinces. David looked uncomfortable, his expensive coat seeming to take up half the room. Melissa's eyes darted everywhere, a flicker of distaste in her gaze that she quickly masked with a bright, false smile. "Oh, Evelyn, how cozy." She said the word, hanging in the air like an insult. We sat down for the meal at my small, wobbly kitchen table. The air was thick with things unsaid. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of their performance. I was the audience for a play about a happy family, and I knew all the lines were lies. Then, as he was carving the turkey, David paused and looked around the room, a genuinely puzzled expression on his face. He looked at me, his brow furrowed. "Mom," he began, and his voice was soft, laced with a confusion that was either real or an act of breathtaking cruelty. "I'm glad we're here, but I have to ask. Did you like the lake house I gave you?" The question dropped into the silence like a stone. The air crackled. I stared at him, my mind unable to form a response. He went on, oblivious. "I just figured, it's so beautiful there. I thought you'd want to have Thanksgiving at your own place. On the water." I slowly turned my head and looked at Melissa. The color had drained from her face. Her perfect smile was gone, replaced by a mask of sheer panic. Her eyes, wide and terrified, were locked on her husband. In that moment, 1,000 disconnected pieces slammed together in my mind. The missing money. The forgotten house. Melissa's tight control. Her panicked expression. It wasn't a lie of omission. It wasn't a mistake. It was something far, far worse. The room was silent, save for the hum of the old refrigerator. And for the first time in the cold light of that Thanksgiving afternoon, I saw the truth. This was the final insult. This was the moment that changed everything. I said nothing. My mind, which had been a fog of confusion and quiet shame for 2 years, was suddenly terrifyingly sharp. The shock was so profound it felt like a physical blow, knocking all the air from my lungs and leaving behind a vacuum of cold, hard fact. I looked from my son's genuinely bewildered face to my daughter-in-law's mask of terror, and I saw everything. What? What lake house? David asked again, his voice dropping, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the room's atmosphere. He was looking at me, but the question was for his wife. Melissa recovered in a split second. A nervous laugh, high and brittle, escaped her lips. Oh, David, darling, don't be silly. You know we've been having issues with the title transfer. The lawyers are just so slow, she said, waving a dismissive hand. She turned her brilliant smile on me, but it was strained, desperate. Isn't that right, Evelyn? It's just been a nightmare of red tape. She was asking me to participate in the lie, to save her. In that moment, she wasn't seeing a mother-in-law. She was seeing a pawn she could move to protect her queen. She was seeing the old woman, a character in her story she assumed had no lines of her own. I held her gaze. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't feel the hot sting of anger. I felt something else, something colder, and much, much heavier. It was the shift from enduring pain to executing a plan. The woman who had scrubbed floors to protect her pride was gone. In her place was someone else, a woman forged in the cold fire of this revelation. It was not revenge I rose for. I rose for clarity. A crushing, absolute clarity. I simply looked at her, my face a blank canvas, and I continued to say nothing. My silence was an answer more damning than any accusation I could have made. It was a mirror, and in it she could see her own deceit reflected perfectly. My whole life I had been quiet to keep the peace. Now my silence was a weapon. David saw it too. His eyes darted between us, the confusion on his face slowly being replaced by a dawning horror. Red tape. For 2 years, he asked, his voice low and dangerous. 2 years? And the $1,500 a month, Mom, has that been held up in red tape too? He finally looked at me, really looked at me, and saw the truth in my silence, in my threadbare cardigan, in the exhaustion etched around my eyes. The lie, so carefully constructed, was collapsing in on itself. Melissa began to stammer a string of incoherent excuses about bank errors and lost mail, but the damage was done. They left soon after, a cloud of toxic silence following them out the door. I was left alone in my tiny apartment with the ruins of a Thanksgiving meal and the terrifying, liberating weight of the truth. I did not feel fear, not despair, but the knowledge that I had time. And I had a story to tell. After the door clicked shut behind them, the silence they left behind was different. It was no longer the quiet hum of loneliness. It was the charged, buzzing silence before a storm. I stood there for a long time, looking at the half-eaten turkey and the wilting flowers. The woman from an hour ago would have cried. She would have sunk into a chair and let the grief and betrayal wash over her. But I did not feel grief. I felt a strange, cold calm. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I simply made tea. I walked over to the table and methodically scraped the leftover food into the trash can. I washed the plates and dried them, placing them back in the cupboard. I moved with a deliberate, steady purpose, my actions a quiet rebellion against the chaos that had just erupted. Then I filled the kettle with water and put it on the stove. While I waited for it to boil, I sat in my worn armchair, not thinking, just breathing. My mind was no longer a frantic swirl of questions. It was a placid, dark lake, and I was waiting for the truth to surface. I was no longer confused. I was no longer waiting for an apology. I was planning. Wisdom doesn't shout. It remembers. And in that moment, I was remembering everything. The kettle shrieked. I poured the boiling water over a peppermint tea bag, the steam warming my face. I held the warm mug in my chapped hands, the simple heat a comfort. This was not about revenge. Revenge was a hot, messy emotion, and what I felt was the opposite of heat. It was a cold, precise resolve. This was about reality. Melissa had created a fiction, a comfortable story, where she was the heroine, and I was a distant, well-cared-for character. I was simply going to introduce her to the facts. And what is a fact, if not a debt, that must eventually be paid? I understood now that this wasn't something that could be solved with a tearful phone call or a family argument. This was bigger. This involved money, property, and lies that were likely illegal. This was a world of documents and laws, a world I knew nothing about. But I knew where to start. My strength had always been in my quiet endurance. Now my silence would become my strategy. I would gather my facts before I showed my hand. I drank my tea, and as the warmth spread through me, a simple, clear thought formed in my mind: paper remembers what people forget. And I was going to find the paper. I was going to collect every single receipt. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. The sky outside was a pale, bruised purple. I put on my best coat, the one I saved for funerals and doctor's appointments, and I took the bus downtown. I didn't go to a bank or a lawyer's office. I went to the public library. It was my sanctuary, a place of quiet order and infinite information. But today I wasn't there for novels or history books. I sat down at one of the public computers, the keyboard cool beneath my fingertips. My heart was pounding, a steady, nervous rhythm against my ribs. I had never done this before. It felt like a transgression, like spying. But it was my own life I was spying on. I navigated to the official government website that allowed you to get a free copy of your credit report. I typed in my name, my date of birth, my social security number. The questions were a stark reminder of how much of your identity is just a collection of numbers and facts. After a moment, the report loaded onto the screen. I started to read, my eyes scanning the familiar lines. First, my one small, maxed-out credit card. From years ago, my history of on-time rent payments reported by a long-ago landlord. And then I saw it. Under the heading Open Accounts, there was a list that made my breath catch in my throat. There was a credit card from a fancy department store opened 18 months ago with a balance of over $7,000. There was a car loan for a luxury sedan taken out last year. And then the final damning piece of evidence: a checking account at a national bank I had never, ever done business with. It was opened 2 years ago. The mailing address listed for all these accounts was not my address. It was a P.O. box in a town 30 miles north. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. This was it. This was the paper. It was a detailed, documented history of a life I hadn't lived, of money I hadn't spent, of a person who wore my name but was a complete stranger. She hadn't just intercepted David's gifts. She had stolen me. My name, my identity, my good credit I had spent a lifetime building. She had wrapped herself in it and used it as her own personal line of credit. I felt a cold, righteous anger begin to burn away the fog of shame. I took a deep breath. I clicked the print button. The library printer whirred to life, spitting out page after page of her crimes. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, a stack of receipts for a debt she was going to pay. This was my first piece of evidence. The first stone I would use to rebuild my life. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a creditor. And I was coming to collect. Holding the stack of printed credit reports, I knew my next step: couldn't be taken alone. The world of P.O. boxes, fraudulent accounts, and identity theft was a foreign country, and I needed a guide. I couldn't afford a high-priced lawyer from one of the gleaming uptown towers. My cleaning job wages wouldn't even cover a consultation. They say you don't owe them permission to protect yourself, but sometimes you need help finding the right weapons. I remembered a flyer I had seen tacked to the community board at the library, Legal Aid of Mecklenburg County, free legal services for seniors. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. The office was in a modest brick building a world away from the marble lobbies of corporate law. The woman who greeted me was young, no older than my grandson would have been if I had one. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense air about her. She wore a simple black dress, and her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She led me to a small, cluttered office and listened patiently as I laid out my story. I didn't cry or embellish. I spoke in the calm, measured tone of the matriarch chronicler I had become. I stated the facts: my son, the promised money, the non-existent lake house, the Thanksgiving revelation. Then I placed the stack of credit reports on the desk between us. "This is what I found this morning," I said simply. Sarah picked up the papers and began to read. Her expression shifted from polite interest to focused intensity, and then to a slow, burning anger on my behalf. She flipped through the pages, her brow furrowed. "Mrs. Miller," she said, her voice low and serious, "this is more than just a family dispute. This is grand larceny. This is identity theft. These are felonies." She looked up at me, her eyes meeting mine. In that moment, I didn't feel like a charity case. I felt like a client. I felt seen. "Your daughter-in-law didn't just steal money from you," Sarah said, her voice firm. "She stole your name, and we are going to get it back." She told me she would take my case pro bono. She saw the injustice clear as day. She was young and perhaps a little idealistic, but she was sharp as a tack, and her anger was a righteous fire that warmed me. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't alone. I had an ally. Sarah Jenkins was the first person outside of my family to know the truth, and she believed me without question. The two of us, a 72-year-old cleaning woman and a 28-year-old legal aid lawyer, were about to go to war with a millionaire's perfect wife. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about the law. And the law, like paper, has a very long memory. Our investigation began not with angry phone calls, but with quiet, methodical work. Sarah was a master of procedure. She explained that in a case like this, emotion was a liability. Our power lay in building an irrefutable mountain of evidence. Our weapon was the paper trail. First, we filed a police report for identity theft. The officer was sympathetic, but explained that without more concrete proof, linking Melissa directly, it was a difficult case to pursue. It was a frustrating but necessary step. It created an official record of the crime. It was the first document in what would become our arsenal. Next, Sarah drafted formal letters to the credit card companies and the bank that held the fraudulent account. I watched her work, her focus absolute. She was my instrument of clarity. Citing the police report number, she demanded copies of the original applications for every account opened in my name. The law was on our side. Within weeks, the documents started to arrive at Sarah's office. We sat together at her desk, a pot of strong coffee between us, and pieced together the anatomy of Melissa's deception. Each application was a new layer of her treachery. The forms were filled out online using my social security number and date of birth. The signature on the digital signature line was a crude, looping version of my name, Evelyn Miller. It looked nothing like my own neat, careful script. She had not even bothered to make it look real. That was the depth of her contempt. She believed I was too old, too stupid, too invisible to ever check. The bank account was the centerpiece of the fraud. Sarah obtained the transaction history. We saw the direct deposits from David's company, exactly $1,500, arriving like clockwork on the first of every month for 24 months, a total of $36,000. And we saw the withdrawals. Cash taken out at ATMs near their luxurious home, online purchases from high-end boutiques, payments made to the fraudulent credit cards. She had created a closed loop, a secret financial ecosystem where she funneled my son's money into her own pockets, all under the legal shield of my name. She had turned me into a ghost that paid her bills. She had been meticulous, but she had made one small, arrogant mistake. On the bank application under the section for a secondary contact, she had listed her own cell phone number. It was a tiny thread, but for Sarah, it was enough. It was the first concrete link between the phantom Evelyn Miller, who lived at a P.O. box, and Melissa Miller, the millionaire's wife. She got arrogant, Sarah murmured, circling the phone number with a red pen. Thieves always do. They think they're too smart to get caught. I looked at the stack of papers growing on her desk: bank statements, credit applications, transaction histories. It was a biography of a crime. I thought of a saying my grandmother used to have: "The devil is in the details," and Melissa had left her fingerprints all over them. The final piece of the puzzle was the lake house. Sarah's initial search of county property records confirmed what David had said. A cottage on Lake Norman had been purchased 2 years ago, and the legal owner on the deed was listed as Evelyn Miller. She put the house in your name to cover her tracks. With David, Sarah explained, her voice tight with disbelief at the audacity of it all. If he ever got curious and checked the public record, he'd see his mother listed as the owner. It was the perfect camouflage. A house I supposedly owned but had never seen. A gift that was actually a prison for the truth. But owning the deed was one thing. Signing it was another. Sarah sent a formal request to the real estate attorney who had handled the closing. We needed a copy of the closing documents, specifically the page with my signature. It arrived a week later by courier. Sarah laid the document on her desk, and we both stared at it. There it was, at the bottom of a page, full of dense legal text, my name, Evelyn Miller, signed in a confident, flowing script. It was a beautiful forgery, far more skilled than the sloppy digital signatures on the bank forms. Melissa must have practiced tracing my real signature from an old birthday card or a check I had once written. She had captured the slant and the shape of it almost perfectly. But she missed the small details, the way I always loop my E just so, the slight, almost imperceptible hesitation before the M. To a stranger, it was my signature. To me, it was a mockery, a perfect imitation of something real, which made it all the more false. "We need a handwriting expert," Sarah said immediately. "This is the smoking gun for the property fraud. We can prove this isn't your signature." She was right. This was the most damning document of all. Stealing $36,000 was one thing. Forging a name on a legal deed for a property worth $500,000 was another level of criminality entirely. She hadn't just created a fake bank account. She had manufactured a completely false legal reality. She had tried to build her kingdom on borrowed ground and forgot to ask who held the deed to her soul. I traced the forged signature with my finger, not touching the paper. I felt a chill run through me. This graceful, confident line was the physical manifestation of her arrogance. It was the mark of a woman so certain of her own cleverness that she believed she could simply sign my life away, and no one would ever be wise enough to question it. She had signed a legal document as me, but in reality, she had been signing her own confession. Every loop and curve was a testament to her crime, a permanent record of her greed. I smiled not out of revenge, but out of something stronger clarity. The truth was finally mine to hold. With the forged deed, our mountain of evidence was complete. We had the credit reports, the bank applications with her phone number, the transaction histories showing the theft, and now a forged legal document for a high-value asset. Sarah scanned everything, creating a secure digital file. The time for silent investigation was over. It was time to contact David. Sarah insisted I be the one to make the call, but that she be on the line with me. "He needs to hear this from you, Evelyn," she said gently. "But I will be here to guide you and to step in if needed. We present the facts. No accusations, no emotion, just the evidence." My hand trembled as I dialed his number. It was a Thursday afternoon. I prayed Melissa wouldn't answer. Luck was with me. Mom David's voice was hesitant, cautious. "We hadn't spoken since that disastrous Thanksgiving, David." I said, my own voice steady, drawing strength from Sarah's presence beside me. "I need you to listen very carefully. I am on a conference call with my lawyer, Sarah Jenkins." There was a silence on the other end of the line. "Your lawyer?" "Yes," I said. "Some things have come to my attention, and I needed legal guidance. Sarah is going to send you an email. It contains a number of documents. I need you to open it and look at them while we are on the phone." Sarah hit send. I heard the faint ping of a notification on David's end. I could hear his sharp intake of breath as he opened the file. I pictured him in his high-tech office scrolling through the evidence of his wife's betrayal. "What would you do if you discovered the life you built was a lie paid for with the stolen identity of your own mother?" I remained silent, letting the documents speak for themselves. I heard the frantic clicking of his mouse. "What is this?" he finally whispered, his voice strained with disbelief. "These credit cards. This car loan." "That is a copy of my credit report, David," I said, my voice calm and clear. "Those are accounts opened in my name over the past 2 years. The bank account, the deposits, that's the money I sent. Where did it go?" "It was withdrawn from ATMs near your home," I stated, reading from the summary Sarah had prepared, "and used for online purchases delivered to your address. The final blow was the deed." "And David," I said, my voice dropping slightly, "please look at the last document. It is the deed to the lake house. Please look at the signature." A long, ragged silence stretched on. It was the sound of a man's world being systematically dismantled piece by irrefutable proof. I heard a choked, guttural sound, a noise of pure anguish. He wasn't just my son. He was her husband. The betrayal cut him twice as deep. "That's not your signature," he finally breathed. "No, David," I said, "it is not." And with those words, I knew I hadn't just exposed a crime. I had ended a marriage. The phone call shattered David's world. The carefully constructed reality he had lived in for 2 years crumbled into dust. He told me later that after he hung up, he sat in his office for an hour staring at the screen, scrolling through the proof of his wife's treachery over and over again, as if trying to force his mind to accept an impossible truth. The man who left that office was not the same one who had entered it. The passive, trusting husband was gone, replaced by a man cold with fury and the bitter sting of betrayal. He drove home the digital file of evidence open on his phone beside him. He found Melissa in their living room, arranging flowers in a vase, humming softly to herself. She looked up and smiled when he walked in the picture of domestic bliss. He didn't speak. He simply walked over to her and held out his phone. Her smile faltered as she saw the screen. She saw the bank statements, the credit card bills, the forged signature on the deed. The color drained from her face, leaving her perfect features looking stark and brittle. Her carefully crafted world dissolved in an instant. There was no room for lies, no space for excuses. The evidence was absolute. She crumpled. The impeccable, confident woman he had married disappeared, and in her place was a desperate, frightened criminal caught in the act. The argument that followed was explosive. Through tears and panicked denials that slowly gave way to choked confessions, the full scope of her deception came out. It had started small. She'd told herself she would just borrow the first month's deposit. But it was so easy. David was so busy, so trusting. I was so distant, so quiet. No one noticed. So she took the next month's deposit and the next. Greed like a weed had taken root. She opened the first credit card for a shopping spree, telling herself she deserved it. Then the car. The lake house was the ultimate act of hubris, a way to secure a $500,000 asset, all while making David believe he was the most generous son in the world. She had built a secret empire on a foundation of lies, using my good name as her shield. She had become the star of a play only she was directing, and now the curtain was coming down. By the end of the night, their marriage was a smoking ruin. David told her to pack a bag and leave. He called his own lawyer, a man who specialized in high-stakes, messy divorces. The unraveling was swift and brutal. Melissa, the woman who had lived a life of curated perfection, was about to find out what it was like to have nothing. She was about to learn that consequences are a debt that cannot be forged or rerouted. They always arrive at the correct address. Melissa's downfall was not a dramatic courtroom scene from a movie. It was a quiet, procedural dismantling of her life, executed with the cold precision of legal documents. My lawyer, Sarah, worked in tandem with David's divorce attorney. The criminal charges for fraud and identity theft were filed, but the more immediate battle was a civil one. David's lawyer filed for divorce, citing financial fraud as the primary cause. Because Melissa had used stolen funds and fraudulent credit to finance much of their lavish lifestyle, and because the state of North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, her claim to their marital assets was profoundly compromised. Her deception had poisoned the entire financial well of their marriage. She thought she was building a fortune, but she had only been racking up debt, financial and moral. The barrage of missed calls was not to my phone, but from Melissa's newly hired desperate lawyers to David's legal team. I heard later there were 99 plus missed calls in a single day. They tried to negotiate to salvage something from the wreckage. They argued for a share of the business for alimony for the house. But they had no leverage. We had the paper trail. We had the receipts. The consequences were a cascade. The bank froze the fraudulent accounts. The credit card companies closed the cards and began their own fraud investigations. The luxury car she drove was repossessed, as the loan was based on a stolen identity. The beautiful home they shared, the one with the white carpets and glass tables, was a marital asset that David had owned before the marriage. She was forced to vacate it immediately. In a matter of weeks, Melissa went from being a pampered millionaire's wife to being homeless with her assets frozen and facing multiple felony charges. She had been so afraid of not having enough that she ended up with nothing at all. I stayed completely removed from the process. I did not attend the meetings. I did not speak to her. My victory was not in seeing her suffer. It was in the quiet, methodical reassertion of the truth. My name was cleared from the fraudulent debts. The banks and credit card companies, faced with irrefutable proof of identity theft, wrote them off as losses. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, ground forward with an unstoppable momentum. I received a letter from her lawyer one day. It was a handwritten note from Melissa, full of apologies and pleas for forgiveness, begging me to ask David to be lenient, to ask the district attorney to drop the charges. It was the desperate plea of a woman who wasn't sorry for the crime, but sorry she had been caught. I read it once, then folded it neatly and handed it to Sarah. It was just one more piece of paper for the file. I was not the villain in her story, nor the savior. I was simply the lesson. A month after the unraveling, a package arrived for me. It was from David's lawyer. Inside was a thick stack of documents and a single heavy key. The documents legally affirmed that all fraudulent debts against my name were null and void. The deed to the lake house had been cleared, the forged signature expunged, and a new valid deed issued solely and truly in my name. The key was for the front door. David drove me there himself. The drive was quiet, filled with a fragile, unspoken understanding. He had been betrayed as much as I had. He was grappling with the guilt of his own blindness, of how his success had made him so disconnected from my reality that he couldn't see the truth right in front of him. We were two survivors of the same shipwreck, learning how to navigate again. We pulled into the driveway of a small, charming cottage painted a soft shade of blue. A wide porch with 2 rocking chairs faced the water, which sparkled under the afternoon sun. It was more beautiful than any picture I had seen online. I walked to the front door, the key feeling solid and real in my hand. It slid into the lock and turned with a satisfying click. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was filled with light. Big windows looked out over the lake. It was furnished simply but beautifully, with comfortable chairs and sturdy wooden tables. On the kitchen counter, there was a brand new kettle and a box of peppermint tea. A small, thoughtful touch from David. I walked through the quiet rooms, my hand trailing along the walls. This was not a place of shame or secrets. It was a place of peace. It was the home my son had wanted for me, the gift he had given 2 years ago that had finally found its way to me. I hadn't lost a home. I had reclaimed a world. I went out to the porch and sat in one of the rocking chairs looking out at the endless expanse of water. David came and sat in the chair beside me. We didn't speak for a long time. We just watched the sunlight dance on the waves. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he finally whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I reached over and placed my hand on his. "The house is beautiful, David," I said. "Thank you." It was an acceptance and it was a forgiveness. We had a long way to go, but we were home. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering and choosing not to let the pain have the final word. It's about choosing to build something new on the foundation of what was broken. I live in the house by the water now. My days are still quiet, but it's a different kind of quiet. It is not the empty, humming silence of loneliness, but the serene, living quiet of nature. It's the sound of the wind whispering through the pine trees, the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, the distant cry of a loon across the water. The house is quiet now, not empty. Quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. David visits me every weekend. He is more present now than he has been in a decade. He helps me in the garden and we sit on the porch and talk, really talk for hours. We are rebuilding the bridge that Melissa burned stone by painful stone. He is a good son. I was right to hold on to that belief even when it felt like a foolish prayer. He was just lost for a while. I no longer have to clean offices. The $36,000 that Melissa stole was repaid to me from her share of the liquidated marital assets. It sits in a bank account that is mine and mine alone. I don't need much, but the knowledge that it is there is a comfort, a symbol of my reclaimed independence. Sometimes a wave of anger washes over me when I think of the past 2 years. I think of my chapped hands and my aching back of the cold and the worry. But the anger passes like a summer storm over the lake. I won't let her live in my head the way she lived in my house. I won't set myself on fire to keep her memory warm. I told this story not for pity and not for revenge. I told it for the woman listening right now, the one who has been made to feel invisible in her own kitchen, in her own family, in her own name. If you have ever been called a burden, if you have ever stayed silent just to keep the peace, if you have ever been made to feel like your love was a weight instead of a gift, then know this: you are not alone. You are not invisible, you are not crazy, and you are not done yet. Your strength is not in your shouting, but in your endurance. Your power is in your knowledge of your own worth. And your story is not over. Peace doesn't need applause. And healing doesn't ask for recognition. It just needs a quiet place to begin. Thank you for listening to my story. Evelyn's story reminds us that the heaviest burdens are often invisible and the greatest strengths are forged in silence. It's a testament to the fact that you can be erased from photographs, conversations, and even bank accounts. But you can never be fully erased from your own truth. If you have ever felt that your love was treated as a liability, or your quiet endurance was mistaken for weakness, then you understand the world Evelyn lived in. What would you do to reclaim your story? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Here at True Stories. She Never Told we believe that every woman has a chapter that deserves to be read with clarity. These are the accounts that have been ignored for too long. Don't forget to subscribe to True Stories. She Never Told and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment when the quiet truth finally finds its voice. Thank you for listening.